If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hey all, just wanted to jump in real quick with a few announcements. As you'll soon hear, our normal intro got off track. Honestly, more time talking with Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow is a win anyhow. First, I want to give a shout out to everyone. We hit 10,000 downloads last month. In the grand scheme of things, it's a small number, but for a podcast that is a niche within a niche, that's pretty damn good. So thank you to all of you out there listening. We love you guys. Second, I want to announce that we are doing away with the numbering system. Honestly, I am starting to get confused, so I can only imagine that you are too. So from here on, episodes will just be named. I'll be going back to delete the numbers out of the titles of the episodes eventually, but I'll put them in the description for all of the episodes that were previously numbered. That way, when I refer back to them, you'll know which ones they are. Third, don't forget to pre-order Kat's new book, Devil's Gun. That is a sequel to You Sexy Thing. It is coming out very soon. And finally, you can find Diane's newest story in Bioluminescent, a solarpunk anthology published by Android Press. Okay, well that's enough for now. Let's get to the interview. Hello and welcome to If This Goes On, Don't Panic. In this episode, we have law professor and author Rebecca Giblin and author, activist, journalist Cory Doctorow. So Kat, how are things going?
We're okay. We got in yesterday very late from a book tour with several stops, and we're about to do one more together before going our separate ways. And it's okay. We're both a little tired, I would say, but feeling good about the book.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty excited actually, because this particular stop is in Hollywood, and to an Australian, there's still something very romantic about that, and that's going to mark our formal publication date tomorrow. So pretty into it.
I got to impress Rebecca with the Daggy strip mall private mailbox where I get my mail, because it's also used by a publicist who has 8x10s of all of his clients behind the counter as though they use it too. So it appears that I get my mail at the same like UPS joint that Brad Pitt does.
Yeah, I think also it was gun whirled across the street, so I got impressed and horrified equally in just about the same moment, which happens a lot when I'm with Doctorow.
Yeah, here in Burbank, we have the highest rate of per capita gun stores of anywhere in America because we're across the city line from LA, where there are very few, if any, gun stores. I think there are a few grandfathered in, but they're zoned out. So they're all in our little patch here.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
Speaking of hopefulness, the first couple of days of lockdown, those gun stores had lineups around the block. And I thought, God, these people are so optimistic. They think they're going to be able to shoot viruses.
Oh, right? Before you were all on here, we were talking about everybody not masking and how frustrating it is for those of us who are still trying to mask and trying to be good. And even our really smart engineer and lawyer friends who are like, yeah, well, I read this one article that said this one thing, and I'm just not going to mask anymore.
In confirmation bias monthly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So before we go on any further, let me read your bios so our listeners know who you all are in case they don't already know. Okay, so with us today we have Rebecca Giblin. She is a professor at Melbourne Law School, where she works at the intersection of law and culture, leading interdisciplinary teams researching issues around creators' rights, access to knowledge, and technology regulation. She is director of the Intellectual Property Research Institute of Australia and heads up the Authors' Interest and e-lending projects, as well as Untapped, the Australian Literary Heritage Project. Chokepoint Capitalism is her third book, but the first that anyone will actually read. I'm guessing the other two are academic.
That's right. They're also very good if anyone wants to check them out.
And we also have Cory Doctorow. He is a science fiction author, activist, and journalist. He is the author of many books, most recently Radicalized and Walk Away, Science Fiction for Adults. How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism, nonfiction about monopoly and conspiracy, In Real Life, a graphic novel, and the picture book Posey the Monster Slayer. His latest book is Attack Surface, a standalone adult sequel to Little Brother. His next nonfiction book is Chokepoint Capitalism, which we will be talking about today, with Rebecca Giblin about monopoly, monopsony, and fairness in the creative arts labor market. In 2020, he was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. So before we get started on Chokepoint Capitalism, Cory, I just want to mention real quick, I took Posey the Monster Slayer out of the library like a month ago, and my kid will not let me return it. So I guess I will be purchasing it soon.
Well, that's tell the kid that my kid thanks them because that's going towards her college fund. So
perfect. I will. So let's jump in and talk about your book then. Why don't you give us a little origin story about this book? How did the two of you team up, and then how did you decide to write this book?
It all started when I was bitten by a radioactive Rebecca Giblin.
It happens. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead and tell them, Rebecca.
Oh, look, we've come across each other a few times over the years, and we ended up doing an event together in Melbourne back in 2018. And we're in a taxi together on the way back into the city, and we were just sort of despairing together about the way that when we talk about getting artists paid, so often it is framed as this false dichotomy. Like, you got to pick a side. Do you want to pick creators or do you want to pick users? Right? Mm-hmm. And obviously that's wrong on so many different levels. But we were both saying, well, but the problem is it doesn't, even if you accept that false premise, right? If it's big content or it's big tech, if they've got enough power, they are going to shake you down. And we were seeing it everywhere. And so that, I guess that was the germ of the thing. And then fast forward to the start of 2020, the world was cancelled. So was all the field work and everything I had planned for the year. And I actually had this rare moment of real freedom where, despite being locked in my apartment, this was in Melbourne, locked in my apartment, where I thought, well, actually, I don't have to do all that stuff I had planned for this year. What do I really want to do instead? And I realized that I really wanted to tell that story about how big business had captured creative labor markets. I started working on it. I was a couple weeks in. It was exhilarating and frustrating and lonely and impossible and wonderful. And I started thinking, this would be so much better if Cory Doctorow wrote this book with me. Anyway, so this is the thing you can do, actually. You can just email Cory and ask him to write a book with you.
Please don't do that.
I did just this one time. I got him in maybe a little bit of a vulnerable moment, because when Cory's anxious, he likes to write.
That's true. I have 7 more books coming out in the next 3 years, which gives you some insight into my mental state lately.
Anyway, so the rest is history.
Wow. Well, even by Kat standards, 7's a lot, and Kat is very prolific. So.
Not that prolific.
Don't deny it, Kat. You're a prolific writer. Don't deny it.
4 of them were written by GPT-3.
I think one of the things that would really be handy to our listeners, and Ellen and I were talking about this earlier. I'm actually stealing your question, Ellen. Can you talk about monopsony and what that is?
Yeah, so we, as Rebecca likes to say, everybody knows what Monopoly is because we got the board game, but monopsony is a little rarer in our common understanding. So a monopoly is a market where sellers have power, so they can make prices go up, for example. And there's a kind of like easy dictionary definition of monopoly that's one seller. That's the mono in monopoly. But really, like when we talk about it in competition law, when we say monopoly, what we mean is a market where sellers have power, where there's like a few sellers. The sellers have divided up the territory. Technically, like maybe oligopoly is the right word. And then on the other side, there's monopsony. And monopsony is when buyers have power. So they can lower prices because there's only a few places to sell. So, today, as we're recording this, the White House has just announced that it's going to use a 19th century meatpacking law to reform the way that chicken growers are compensated, because all of the chicken growers in America have to sell to one chicken packer. The 3 major packers in the country have divided up all their territory. So you can only go to one packer if you're a farmer, and the packers decide how much they're going to pay them, and they pay them effectively just enough to roll over their loans, stay in debt, and grow another crop of chickens for them the next year. And so we've all been in touch with monopsony, especially in the arts. You know, if you've only got 4 major publishers or 3 major labels or 4 major studios, we all know what it's like to live in a buyer's market when you're a seller. And, you know, again, it's not like there's really just one buyer. I mean, there is in the case of like Kindle books and Audible books, but mostly there's a handful of buyers. And so technically it's like an oligopsony. But when we say monopsony, that's what we mean. We mean a place where buyers have power.
Okay.
And monopsonies are they're much trickier to deal with, actually, than monopolies. For one thing, they arise at way lower market concentrations. So a buyer that's even got 10% of the market can really sort of squeeze down their suppliers and workers. And for another thing, the traditional antitrust remedies, which are, you know, things like breaking up companies or making them pinky swear not to abuse their power, work particularly poorly for pretty wonky reasons we won't get into when it comes to monopsony. So what we really wanted to do with this book is actually sort of leave the antitrust stuff to the antitrust experts, and for us to think about all of the different legal supports that contribute to monopoly and monopsony in the arts, and then a bunch of subversive, heretical, but also shovel-ready, detailed proposals for how we can widen those choke points out and get artists and other artistic investors more power.
Yeah, so you mentioned choke point, so I just want to point out to our listeners that kind of the monopoly and the monopsony together in one company creates that choke point, right?
Well, it doesn't have to be both. It could be one or the other. But what we mean by the choke point is that we've got a place where you've got, you know, one or more companies that's able to sort of squeeze down, create like an hourglass shaped market where they're kind of mediating access between audiences and creators in order to extract more than their fair share of value.
So, yeah, think about the Uber market for a kind of choke point capitalism, where, you know, you have a bunch of drivers and you have a bunch of passengers. The drivers want to drive, and the passengers want to pay them to do so. But to get there, they have to give a bunch of money to Uber. And Uber has been ratcheting up the amount of money year on year. So at first, Uber was subsidizing all those rides. They were losing 41 cents on the dollar. That got a lot of people to install the Uber app, buy Uber subscriptions, get habituated to Uber, and so on. And it got a lot of drivers to become Uber drivers because people were really happy to get in an Uber kind of at the drop of a hat because it was so cheap to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. But the drivers were getting paid a reasonable amount because they were the rides were being subsidized by their investors, which in this case was the Saudi royal family who backed a Japanese investment fund called SoftBank that you know lost $35 billion on Uber in its early years. And then, you know, once they got to the point where they were quite dominant, where a lot of the domestic taxi services had gone out of business, where we had abandoned transit for a decade and it was getting harder and harder to get a bus, then the prices started going up and the compensation to the drivers started going down. They had that two-sided market. They could squeeze in both directions.
And we can understand this as well. Some listeners will be familiar with Amazon's flywheel, which they love to talk about, and they describe it as this virtuous cycle. So they talk about how, you know, they offer this amazing choice, and then that attracts more customers, and then that attracts more suppliers, and that, you know, helps them reduce the prices, and then it's all just wonderful, and the cycle continues. And what we show is that cycle's not virtuous. It's anti-competitive. What they're really doing is designing their business in ways that locks in their customers, because then that locks in the suppliers, right? Once Amazon's got a big enough share of the market, then people, their customers are there, and so the suppliers have to be there as well. Then they use the power that they've got there as well, and those profits that they make, to eliminate their competitors so that customers and suppliers have ever less choice. And then they use that resulting power to drive down the prices that they pay to producers, so like publishers, to authors, in order to unsustainably low levels. And it's reached a pretty astonishing point. It's my first time back in the States since just before the world ended. And I've just been shocked to see that nearly every package that's being delivered, especially in New York, where I spent the first week or two, has got Prime tape all over it.
So true. So true. So you mentioned in your book that podcasting is kind of in a unique place. So and us being a podcast, Kat and I thought maybe we should talk about how Chokepoint Capitalism is affecting podcasting. So podcasting hasn't quite gotten to that point yet, right? Where it hasn't been choked off yet. There's still independent creators like us, for example, who can go and do things, and we don't need to kowtow to anybody. How is Chokepoint Capitalism threatening to affect podcasts?
So yeah, let's talk. We have to first talk about what a podcast actually is. I think a lot of people who aren't on the tech side don't really remember what or understand what's happening under the hood with a podcast. Mm-hmm. So a podcast is just a special kind of text file. It's called an XML file. You can just open it up in Word or whatever text editor you use and read it. And it just says something like name of the podcast, and then it says episode, name of the episode, and then it says description of the episode, and then it says URL of the episode. And that URL is just an MP3. So any MP3 that's on the web anywhere that has a URL, you can just stick in there. So like when you guys are finished with this podcast and you record it and you launch it, I can put up in my podcast feed, I can put up an episode that has a link to you guys, that has a link to this episode. And people who subscribe to my podcast will download the MP3 that you've put up. So that's pretty wild when you think about it. It's a pretty wide open kind of service. It means that it's very hard to enclose it, because there are all these directories that just list the places where you can go and download these text files that describe the episodes. And if you have a podcatcher and you hit refresh on it, all it does is it goes to the text file that describes the podcast and it downloads a new copy and it checks to see whether anything new was added to the top of it. And if there is, it just downloads it. And so because all of these components are sort of open and federated, anyone can put a text file on the internet that describes a podcast. That text file can link to any MP3 file anywhere on the internet. Any aggregator can just list all those text files, just collect the URLs of all those text files. And if you have a new podcast, you say, hey, my text file's over here, come and get it. And whenever your subscribers search to see whether or not there's a podcast called, whatever, Honey Roasted Landlords, it'll find that podcast and just, put the URL for that text file in their list. And whenever they hit refresh, it'll go and see if there's a new one. So this is very wide open world, right? And it's underpinning the XML standard. There's some really cool stuff, like you can move your text file somewhere else, and you can have as like the top entry in your text file, hey, this text file is somewhere else, update your link. And then the podcatcher on the other side just goes, oh, hey, there's a new place where I should look for this text file. And it just goes and throws away the old link and adds the new one. So even if, you're hosting your text file at like, Google Cloud or something, and you get beef with them and they're like, all right, you're not welcome on Google Cloud anymore. If you can update that text file one more time and say like, I'm not on Google Cloud anymore, I'm at, self-hosted, or I'm somewhere else, it'll just update. And everyone who subscribes to you, when they see that latest version, they'll go there. So this is this great wide open lock-in resistant standard. You have companies like Spotify that have moved into podcasting, and not just Spotify, other media entities. And what they're doing is they're putting up things that they call podcasts, but that aren't a text file that anyone can access. So Spotify, if you use Spotify to listen to your podcasts, it goes out and it grabs these text files out on the open internet and puts them in Spotify so you can search for them and subscribe to them. But Spotify will also let you, using the Spotify interface, search for podcasts that aren't just a text file. They're actually some proprietary format that Spotify uses. And what they're betting is if there are enough of these proprietary format files, like Joe Rogan getting $100 million, that you will use Spotify as your podcatcher. You will then slowly start to have more and more of the files that are inside your podcatcher list be not just a text file on the open internet, but some proprietary address that you can only access if you have a Spotify subscription. And then what they're going to be able to do is turn around to all the podcasters who aren't inside Spotify's walled garden and say, we're not comfortable having you guys out there in the wide world. Who knows? You could be putting up pornography or, whatever, bad things, terrorism. So we really need you to be inside the walled garden if we're going to let you reach our users, because it's our duty to protect these users. They're paying us for a Spotify subscription. They expect us to keep it all good. And at that point, if you go inside Spotify's walled garden, then they can say things like, we don't like it if you have third-party advertisers or third-party monetization services like Patreon. Who knows? Those guys could be really dodgy. You could be advertising, Alex Jones nutrition supplements or whatever. So we've got an in-house service where we've got our own advertisers, we've got our own monetization service. This is the cut. It may not be as good as the cut you were getting before, but they're really high quality. And by the way, we're bringing you this giant audience. We're Spotify. Right. And so over time, what they get to do is squeeze the workers. And this sounds hypothetical, but it's literally what Twitch just did. Twitch had a bunch of the median Twitch streamer, the people who stream on it, do a 50-50 split with Twitch, which is to say Amazon, Twitch's parent company, takes half the money you earn if you're a Twitch streamer. Mm-hmm. But their top talent were secretly getting 70%. They'd lured them in with a 70% rate. And once they had enough of these 50% little guys in there, and once they had enough of the audience kind of corralled inside of Twitch, having downloaded the Twitch app and using Twitch basically as their television, they turned around to these 70% guys and said, it's really unfair that you make more than everyone else. And at that point, you might expect that they would say, oh, that's why we're going to pay everyone else 70% too, which would make you a sweet summer child. Instead, what they did was they turned to these 70% types and they said, and that's why we're cutting your pay to 50%. Yeah. And they had a great excuse for it, which is we have to do it because our bandwidth costs are really expensive because Amazon's charging a lot for their bandwidth. And if you've been paying attention, you will have noticed that Amazon is Twitch. So
there was that amazing quote, wasn't there, from Sam Biddle saying, so Amazon is charging Amazon so much to run its business via Amazon that Amazon has to cut the amount it pays to creators.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, I've seen a lot of Twitch creators deciding to drop Twitch recently and talking about going to YouTube or something else. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Well, it's frying pan to fire though, right? Because YouTube's another example. It's a classic choke point. Not so much yet in the video game streaming market, but certainly for other kinds of online video. And we see how they are also grinding down the rates they pay to creators. Mm-hmm. There's also a pretty extraordinary lack of transparency over those. That we know that different people are getting paid different amounts, but there's no way to find out how much that is or how it's calculated or whether you're really getting paid fairly. The big record labels complain because they think that YouTube is underreporting the number of times that their content is used on the platform, and they demand that they should have greater transparency. But that's exactly what the recording artists and songwriters have been arguing for decades over the record labels. And in fact, we know with the record labels, they've pulled all kinds of dodgy scams, including things like running a third shift at the record pressing plants, and those records are just going off on trucks with no royalties being paid on them at all. So look, like we were pointing out at the start, as soon as somebody is big enough and has enough power to choke out the amount that's paid to squeeze somebody, like that's what we see them do.
Yeah, I mean, like quitting Twitch and going to YouTube is like saying, I'm tired of my boss grabbing my ass at this McDonald's restaurant. I'm going to Burger King. And then discovering that Burger King is being shouted at by the monopoly meatpacking company that was taking bets on how many of their workers would die of COVID every week because they're not being transparent enough in how much beef they use. And you're like, I kind of hate all of you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we're podcasters and we're in this unique position, what is something that we could do to push back or resist this chokepoint capitalism?
One of the proudest moments in the history of this book is we showed it to an editor who said, well, I really like this book, but I'm not going to buy it because all the solutions at the end, the back half of the book is entirely given over to solutions. Not one of these books, it's like 10 chapters about how terrible things are, an 11th chapter about and that's why you should vote harder. Yeah. Like we have an entire half of the book that's just things that systemically we can do to fix this. And he said all of the solutions in this book are systemic. And it's going to really, bum people out that there's nothing that they can do as individuals. We're like, dude, you are so close to getting it. It's like, which way should I recycle so that climate change ends? And there's just no way to do it. So
I remember we just looked at each other and we're just like, you can't have our book. You don't get it.
So there's not much you can do as an individual. What you can do is get involved in an association. And I'm sure this is a thing that Kat understands intimately, having voted for her as president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, as it was then called. That organizations are where the power is, not individuals.
Well,
and we talk about that in the book. Some of our
I wanted to pull out, actually, I wrote out a quote from the book because this really struck me. Because you talk about kind of collective action as a solution, but you also mention, and let me just read what I've got. You say these systems of monopoly, wage theft, discrimination, environmental devastation, exploitation reinforce each other, so that any territory we win on one front is an advance on all fronts. And I think that is a tremendously inspiring quote, because right now we do get so fucking ground down by, just like assaults from all sides. And so to realize that one small victory in one place is more than one small victory, it's actually it has that ripple effect and goes out, is, I think, a very heartening thing. So did you mean to hearten us? Was that a mistake and you actually wanted to cast us into despair or what?
My doom pilling has been ruined.
I think this is a really hopeful book. Some of the stories in here just really gave me joy when we came across them in the research. So, for example, talking about solidarity, one of the things that we describe is the story of Uber drivers and Postmates drivers, who are some of the most vulnerable workers in our society. And they are forced into these really unfair contracts that do a bunch of things, but including really effectively remove their access to justice, because they prohibit the bringing of class actions, and they force these workers into individual arbitrations instead. And these arbitrations, they're not part of a public court system. They are, private administrative things. They're paid for by the big corporations. And we know from the evidence that does cause the arbitrators to put a pretty heavy thumb on the scale in favor of big business. And they don't have any precedential value that can be leveraged to help other workers in the event that a worker actually does manage to succeed in one. So that's all really dispiriting, because nobody can, afford, a delivery driver can't afford to bring a legal action. A lawyer can't afford to take one on with the prospect of a single verdict. You need it to work at scale in order for that to make sense. But what we saw happened was this really elegant, amazing jujitsu where tens of thousands of these workers coordinated to all bring these arbitration actions at the same time. And now, while one arbitration is way cheaper to defend than one class action, tens of thousands of arbitrations are very, very expensive. And these companies ran to court saying, oh no, this is so unfair. These people are being mean to us. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. This was supposed to be better for us, not worse. And in the end, actually, it was really successful. Uber paid out almost $150 million to its drivers as a result of this coordinated attempt. And so I think there is hope, in that, and like a lot of other stories. Like, Cory, why don't you tell the story of what happened with the Writers Guild of America again?
Yeah, sure. So as mentioned, we're recording this from beautiful downtown Burbank, storied of Johnny Carson, cheap shots, and many other jokes. But we're right in the beating heart of the entertainment industry. And was it 2019? The screenwriters en masse fired every screenwriter in town, fired their agent. And they fired their agents because their agencies, the big four agencies, two of which were owned by big private equity companies, had stopped acting on behalf of their writers. Instead, what they were doing is they were striking these deals where they said to the writers and the other talent they represented, hey, we're not going to take our customary 10% commission. Instead, we're going to get a packaging fee from the studio for bundling together a writer, a director, or a headline actor. And we'll just take, we're such good-natured slobs. We'll just take it out of the fee, and we're not going to take the 10% from you anymore. And what they started to do was agree to significantly lower compensation for their talent in exchange for bigger packaging fees. And they're basically splitting the difference with the studios. And then they started buying studios so then they could negotiate on behalf of their clients with themselves. And this was just so manifestly messed up that all of the writers, including the ones who had so much negotiating clout that they were able to get a pretty good deal despite this corrupt arrangement, all of the writers fired their agents, and they kept them fired for 22 months. And the agencies, especially the big two private equity owned ones, said that there was no way they would ever cave. They had raised giant amounts of money to buy these agencies and then buy all their competitors and merge them. And they had floated tons of debt against the future earnings from these firms. And those future earnings were entirely predicated on this wage theft that they were expecting to get. And basically the writers just stuck to their guns. The big fancy writers and the newbies grinding it out for scale all stuck together as one bargaining unit. And 22 months later, all 4 of the agencies caved.
I love that story.
Yeah.
I love that. Fellow podcasters, DM me.
No, I think that one of the stories that I would like to see more of in science fiction are stories of collective action like that, stories of unionization and people working together. And I think that is, when we talk about hope punk, some of those stories lie in that area.
Yeah. Kat, we did a great panel on this at the Worldcon in San Jose, Con Jose, where we talked about the trade unionism in science fiction. One of the panelists was the late lamented Eric Flint, who was himself a Meatpackers Union organizer and great science fiction writer and editor. And we really got into this. And Eric had a very provocative thesis about this in science fiction, which is that science fiction was read by engineers in the post-war era, in the boom, when engineers had tons of bargaining power because there was a huge demand for their labor and an undersupply of skilled engineers. And they didn't need trade unions because they had negotiating power. And it just became this kind of trope of fiction that if you were a really good worker, you just didn't need the union. You could just, go up to your boss and, cock a snoot and say, like, you pay me better, or I'm going across the street to the other widget place. And for the median analog reader, that was a very comforting story. Yeah,
I think that is very right. And I think, but it also, you mentioned the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, now the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. And that was my understanding of how it was created, was that the big name authors got together and said, the publishers are screwing the smaller writers, and we are going to do our best to create some collective action, despite the fact that we can't unionize.
Yeah, that was Damon Knight, good old lefty hippie from Oregon with a long Santa Claus beard and who wore Birkenstocks all the time. He's one of my Clarion instructors. That's what he was into. He was a proper old hippie.
That's so interesting to hear all that. It's I always love hearing science fiction history personally, especially from people who've actually met them.
Yeah, it's such a young industry that we're all like, apart from Mary Shelley, right? Like we've hung, if you're 51 years old like me, you probably shook the hands of sort of everyone who didn't die young, who was in the golden age.
You may have argued with some of them on the SIFWA boards.
Wow.
On Genie, yeah. And I was, mentored by Judith Merrill.
Well, I know Kat has stories, but she won't tell them on the podcast. I've tried to get her to tell them before, so.
I'll tell them at bars.
Tell us where Harlan called you.
Actually, he did at one point, because he did call and he kept dropping the phone, and I'd hear the phone clatter and I'd hear him yell kind of in the background, "I dropped the phone, Cat Rambo."
Every SIFWA president I've ever spoken to has a story about being called by Harlan Ellison at an awkward hour.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have any history ones, but I don't really fangirl, which is why I can do outrageous things like email Cory Doctorow and ask him to write a book with me. But I saw when you tweeted about recording this episode that Martha Wells liked it.
Oh, yeah.
Martha, if you're listening, Murderbot's my spirit animal. That was a literal squeak.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm gonna tweet at her and make sure that she listens.
Oh.
One of my proud things is that I was reading Martha Wells before Murderbot. You should read her other stuff too. It's all really good.
Oh no, I've definitely read her other stuff, but yeah, Cory will know. Cory will attest that I don't sit here sort of giggling very often. This might be the first time.
I love it. Now, I actually am going to be interviewing her in December, I think is the plan.
Oh, nice.
So we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, she's one of those people. It's like you were saying, Rebecca, you just reach out and try and get people. And, I guess I'm okay with rejection because I do that quite a bit.
Yeah.
You don't get anywhere without asking, but please don't email Cory. Please don't all email Cory, and he'll kill me. And like that, I really like being alive. So
Yeah, my dance card's full.
But you should mail Rebecca. You should mail Rebecca if you want to write a book. And here you go.
Yeah, Rebecca will write a book with you.
Oh, now hang on a second. It was only funny when I did it to you.
I wanted to give another example of one of the solutions from the book, and how we kind of address ourselves to this, and it kind of dovetails nicely with this California writer strike. So, if you are a working professional and you have a royalty basis with your publisher, or your label, or your studio, your contract will generally include the right to audit that royalty statement and make sure that you weren't being ripped off. And while not a lot of creators can afford to hire forensic accountants to go and do that work for them, there's ways that it gets done. Sometimes creators have the money for it, or, organizations like the Science Fiction Writers Association will have like a lottery where they'll draw lots every year, and one or two writers will get their royalty statements audited. And, when you go and you find money that's owed to you, and that is often the case, we cited research from an institution that had done tens of thousands of music royalty audits. And Kat,
sure.
This is going to shock you to your bones, I know, but in only one of those cases was there an error made in the creator's favor. And in all of the others of tens of thousands of cases, the errors were in the favor of the label. I don't understand how this could happen.
Yeah, Cory the other day described it. He described it as an isolated probability storm.
Yeah. They flipped that quarter 100 times and landed on edge every time. It was the wildest thing. So so when you find those irregularities, we spoke to someone who had 6 figures owed to them. You can just say to the label, like, gotcha, or the studio, the publisher, and maybe they'll go, yeah, gosh, we're embarrassed. We didn't know how this mistake happened. We'll just pay you now. That doesn't happen very often. What happens more often is they go, oh no, I'm sorry, you're mistaken. We don't owe you any money. And then you can sue them. And that's very expensive because there's only 4 big publishers and 4 big studios and 3 big labels. And they got a lot of money because they're super consolidated. And it could take you a very long time to get a judgment, even if you win. And you might have to pay a lot of money to your lawyer and end up with no money left over. But they have a solution to this. They will often, again, out of the goodness of their hearts, offer you an incredible settlement where you don't have to sue them. They'll just pay you the money they owe you. But there's this one thing that you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of getting that settlement. And what that means is that if you do find 6 figures that were owed to you, and the chances are it's owed to other people who are in the same situation as you, you can't go around and tell them, hey, you know who's got a bunch of your money? That guy. And here's where he keeps it. And so you can go and ask for it back. Now, because of monopoly, all of these contracts are consummated in either Washington State, California, or New York, right? Amazon plus the publishers plus the studios and labels. Now, contract is a state level matter. And if the states were to adopt a contractual law, a law regarding contract that said, as a matter of public policy, non-disclosure is not enforceable when it relates to financial misconduct discovered in audits of royalty statements, then at the stroke of a pen, those 3 short bills in 3 state houses would put more money in more creators' pockets than all the copyright term extensions of the last 40 years combined. And so these are the kinds of interventions that we advocate for. They are systemic ones. You and I aren't going to personally get our state houses to pass this bill. But also when you think about the blood, sweat, and tears that creators groups have put into advocating for copyright expansions and other interventions that have ultimately amounted to, small potatoes for us, if we were to orient ourselves around these kinds of solutions the ones that actually make big material changes, the ones that address our interests, not our publishers, studios, and labels' interests, that is the secret to making a hell of a lot of money for a hell of a lot of creators.
Hear, hear.
Yes, absolutely. So I kind of want to pull this out and look at a bigger picture for a second. What is the effect of all of this on things like climate change and human rights?
Well, so I think that these are they're interrelated phenomena. So it's not that these are the effects of it, but these share a common cause. So there's like an old saw, I'm guilty of it, a trope that says the reason our internet laws are so bad is because our lawmakers are like stupid elderly technophobes. Senator Ted Stevens and his dump trucks and his series of tubes. But the reality is that there's lots of extremely technical areas of law and regulation that our lawmakers manage to not kill us with, right? Unless you live in Flint, you can probably drink your tap water. Last I looked, there weren't any microbiologists in Congress. And so it's really, the question should be, what is the particular nature of this kind of regulation that makes it so amenable to these kind of parochial distortions, where instead of getting evidence-based policy that benefits all of us, we get a policy that is not grounded in evidence that benefits a small number of people. And, if you're worried about climate change, you are familiar with this story. So again, it's not that like lawmakers are incapable of understanding climate change. They are absolutely capable of understanding it. But as Upton Sinclair has said, it's hard to get someone to understand something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it. And when industries are very concentrated, they get two great benefits when it comes to capturing their regulators. The first is that they have a lot of money, right? The reason companies want to form monopolies is that they allow them to get more profits because they can raise prices and they can suppress wages. And that is a huge advantage to any concentrated sector. It produces lots and lots of wealth for them. But the other thing that they get is low coordination costs. If an industry is like 100 small companies, right? If you remember what New York publishing was like 30 years ago before consolidation, or what bookselling was like before the big mall chains took over and then were driven out of business by the big box stores and Amazon, then it's very hard for them to agree on stuff, right? Like 100 companies, not only can they not agree on what they want to do in their lobbying, they can't even agree on how to cater their annual meetings lunch banquet. Mm-hmm. And so they struggle, right? But when companies are consolidated, they solve that struggle. You look at that picture of Trump with the tech leaders at the top of Trump Tower after the election in 2017, and it's very easy to despair and say, oh, Tim Cook and Jeff Bezos, I thought you were better than that. I don't know why anyone would think they were better than that, but people are like, we thought you were better than that. But even if you're shocked by the fact that they were all sitting down to meet with Trump, I think you should be much more shocked by the fact that they all fit around one table.
Yeah.
Right? Once they all fit around one table, they will get around one table. And once they're around one table, they're going to start negotiating for how to screw the rest of us. And so, the same monopolistic power that corrupts the regulation around the climate emergency is the same monopolistic power that corrupts the regulation around creators' livelihoods and workers' conditions more broadly.
And there's another link as well when we start thinking about how we fix all of this. And this is the hopeful part of the story. All of the, when you're a worker and you don't make very much money and you're living paycheck to paycheck, it doesn't leave you necessarily with a whole bunch of time and energy to be organizing around these other issues, however much you might care about them. So when we can start making inroads on, getting some kind of security around wages and healthcare, that frees up energy to be working more on how do we improve people getting rewarded for caring work? How does that allow us to be mobilizing on climate? There's like a ratcheting effect that can lead to improvements and not just to everything getting worse.
Yeah, like Kat, you'll know that, as a body, science fiction writers do not represent a formidable lobbying force, right?
Yeah.
But when we join in coalition with other writers groups, we have more power. But if we were to join with other kinds of workers with common demands, then we have more power still. And James Boyle, who we quote at the end of the book, is an old pal of mine. He's a copyright professor at Duke University, where he runs the Center for the Public Domain with Jennifer Jenkins. And he has this parable he tells, this story about the term ecology. He says that before the term ecology was coined, there were a lot of issues, but there really wasn't a movement. Because if you cared about owls and I cared about the ozone layer, we weren't obviously fighting the same fight, right? Your birds and my gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere aren't connected in a way that is like obvious unless you have some other frame for it. And that other frame was ecology. And it turned 1,000 issues into one movement. And excessive buyer power, corporate concentration, the corruption of our regulatory process through monopoly, these issues have lots and lots of victims, right? The only cheerleading league left in America is currently being rocked by these, toe-curlingly ghastly scandals about sexual abuse in these leagues. And, the stories are in this one league, and the stories about the abuse were around. People kind of understood that it might have been going on, but they rolled the dice and took their chances because there was only one league to go to. Yeah. Those people think that they're angry about that cheerleading league, but they're not just angry about what that cheerleading league did. If they understood that it's the market structure that allowed the cheerleading league to get away with that abuse, then they would understand that they're on the same side as the truckers in the Port of Los Angeles who are angry that they're being paid sub-starvation wages, who are also on the same side as the people who are angry that there's only 2 companies that makes all the beer, who are also on the same side as the people who are angry that there's one company that makes all the lenses, all the glasses, and owns all the eyewear stores. Every eyewear brand you've ever heard of belongs to this one company, Luxottica Essilor, and they've raised the price of glasses 1,000% in the last decade. We're all on the same side. We just don't know it. So the hopeful pitch here is that if we can just realize that we're all on the same side, that we have this basis for solidarity in this shared adversary, then we become a movement that is unstoppable.
I think that is so dead on. And just, I think that more than anything, you can look at the efforts to divide the population and to set groups against each other and just create chasms. And that has been, I feel, very engineered in many ways.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Alan, do you want to ask a hopeful question now?
Do I want to ask a hopeful question? Well, I did have a question for Rebecca. As we were emailing and setting up this this podcast, Rebecca, you had mentioned that you were big into hope. So I was wondering, why is hope so important to you?
I think it's a feature of neoliberal capitalism that it's designed to make us feel an emptiness inside. Like we are disconnected from the people around us. And this is something that is done deliberately so that we feel an emptiness that many of us try to fill with ever more production and ever more consumption. But I think that I'm seeing people rejecting that. I'm seeing people reaching out and noticing how good it feels to feel connected to other people who are not just their immediate family or the people that they're told that they need to care the most about. And, sometimes that's even I think that helps explain some of these movements we've seen in the last few years. Like how much is the protests we've seen through QAnon and anti-vaxxers actually is that in part explainable by the fact that people have come out and they've found an invigoration and a shared purpose with other people. Now, it might be around something that I don't agree with, but I do think it's also it's filling a need, an inherent human need. And one of the things that I'm really hopeful about is this sensation, especially in the younger generation. They're rejecting all that extra production, all that extra consumption, and they're reaching out, they're forming these connections. And I think that's going to be the thing that saves us.
So I think you inadvertently answered the question that we ask everybody, which is, what is bringing you hope right now? If you feel like you have more to add to that question, go for it. If not, we can just move on to Cory.
Let's get to Cory.
Sure. So I think what gives me hope is that all over the world, you see people who can actually move policy, like make big structural changes, starting to engage with antitrust and monopoly and corporate power. That you see it in the United States, where we have these 3 great appointments from the Biden administration, Lena Khan running the FTC, Tim Wu at the White House, and Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ, who are each of them, like any one of them would be a powerhouse. And together they're kind of this incredible superhero team where, Tim Wu is the guy who coined the term net neutrality. And he's this very detail oriented technical person on this stuff. And last July, or in July 2020, he ghost wrote a memo for Biden. Maybe it was 2021. Ghost wrote a memo for Biden, an executive order on antitrust with 72 bullet points of things that the Biden admin could do right away without congressional oversight, and set up a timeline for doing them. They've hit all their marks. As we record this today, they've just invoked a bunch of new powers that they have, some of them dating back to the 19th century, these laws that have lain dormant that can just be enforced with no more congressional action. And each one of these makes a big material change in the lives of people. Like they're going after baggage charges at airlines and being billed $10 for in-flight Wi-Fi and not getting it. Just stuff that just you wake up every morning and you're like, how is this stupid ripoff not illegal? And the answer is it is. And they figured out how to enforce against it and force them to stop doing it. And they're going across the board, up and down. Jonathan Cantor is this, again, another fireball, guy running the DOJ antitrust. On his first day on the job, he quoted James Comey from his infamous speech from his first day as the chief prosecutor of the Southern District of New York, where he said to his lawyers, how many of you have never lost a case? And, they all proudly stuck their hands up. And he said, you guys are the chicken shit club. If you've never lost a case, you're only fighting the little guys who can't fight back and not the big guys who are really hurting the people in New York. From now on, I expect you to lose some cases. Cantor did the same thing on his first day of the job at DOJ. And then Khan is like, if you wrote Khan as a character in a novel, no one would believe you. So 5-6 years ago, she was a third-year law student at Yale. She wrote this seminal paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. That was a critique of Robert Bork's pro-monopoly book, The Antitrust Paradox, that Ronald Reagan used as his Bible to dismantle antitrust. It was such a stinging rebuke that it set the whole antitrust establishment on its head. And now this young woman in her early 20s,
Early 30s.
In her early 30s. Beg your pardon. She was in her late 20s when she wrote that. In her early 30s, this young woman is now the head of the FTC, and she is kicking ass and taking names. But she's not alone. The UK Competition and Markets Authority has 80 full-time engineers working on big tech questions. The UK or the EU Commission is handing down big fines and passing big laws, taking big swings. The Digital Markets Act is a landmark piece of legislation. Even the Chinese cybersecurity directive is pretty down on corporate power. It's hilarious because whenever we start talking about doing something about big tech, Nick Clegg, who's the disgraced former deputy prime minister of the United Kingdom, who now runs public relations for Facebook on the kind of global government relations side, sort of pops up and says, you have to worry, if we break up Facebook, China will come and get you. Facebook keeps you safe from China. And meanwhile, China is like, those big tech companies that Nick Clegg thinks are agents of soft power. We're rounding up their leaders and sticking them in gulags because we don't think that they're very good ambassadors of China on the world stage. Now, I don't want to put anyone in a gulag, but it kind of makes Clegg's position look pretty risible.
Great. Awesome. I have to say, that's probably the most specific answer to that question I've ever gotten.
Yeah, it was awesome.
I like leaning into the technical explanations.
Yeah.
I love it. That's great. That's fantastic. So, what do you all have coming up next? We've got Chokepoint Capitalism coming up. You said that's being published tomorrow as we write this, which would be September 27th?
Correct.
Yes.
Rebecca, what have you got coming up?
Well, I sort of accidentally started a publishing house during the pandemic as well, which is a way of getting really important out-of-print books available again, but also testing Amazon's claims about whether libraries really do hurt publishers' bottom lines. So I've got that. That's Untapped, the Australian Literary Heritage Project, and a bunch of other work that we're doing. I lead a team in something called the Author's Interest Project, where we work on investigating what would happen if we actually took authors' interests seriously instead of allowing them to be used as stalking horses to mask other people's economic interests. So I'll keep banging on with that.
And I'm, as I said, writing a lot of books. The next book is a thriller. It's a Silicon Valley financial techno thriller called Red Team Blues that comes out at the end of April from Tor Books. And it's a book about the final adventure of a hard-fighting forensic accountant who spent 40 years unwinding every scam in Silicon Valley. And for his final mission, he has to unwind a cryptocurrency scam, which is the scammiest of all the scams.
Great. I love it. And where can we find you all on the interwebs?
Well, I'm at pluralistic.net, and if you go there, you will find my blog, which you can get either there or as RSS or as a newsletter with no surveillance. The blog also has no surveillance or analytics. You can also read it as a daily thread on Twitter or daily threads on Mastodon or on Tumblr or on Medium. So it's syndicated in lots of different ways, and all those links are at the top of pluralistic.net.
Rebecca?
And Rebecca, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Gibli, Gibli, or just Google me. I'm around.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for keeping hope alive.
Oh, we are trying. One episode at a time here.
That's it.
All right, and that was our interview with Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Giblin. Before we continue on, just want to remind you all that we have Patreon. If you so choose to help us out in that way, you can check us out at patreon.com/ifthisgoeson. We have a bunch of stuff going on over there. I actually have been recently thinking about how I want to change that up and kind of revamp that a little bit. So, usually I tell you all what's going on, but I'm not really sure what's going to be going on over there. Something new and exciting, hopefully. We also have a Ko-fi account. That's Ko-fi if you would prefer to give us a one-time donation. But most importantly, you can share us with your friends on Facebook or Twitter or wherever. That is the best way for us to spread our word of hope. How did you feel about the conversation? What did you think? What stuck out to you?
I thought that was terrific. They're both so smart, and it was just so much fun to hear them talking about the book. And I think this feels like an important book.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly talking about an important subject, and I there's just so much to think about in it that I will heartily recommend it to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was telling you, you mentioned how smart they were, and I think all of our guests are very smart in their own ways. Sometimes it's more writing, sometimes it's more something else, but these two, were intimidatingly smart, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
And I just, listening to them both just go through all these examples of all these different things, it was just like, how do they even keep all that in their head?
Oh, God, yeah.
Oh.
No, crazy stuff.
Absolutely. So I also have to say thank you, Kat, for getting them to come on in the first place, because I don't think I would have been able to get Cory on.
Cory approached me, so that was awesome. I was like, yes.
Nice.
At least that's how I remember it happening. I'd have to go back and make sure. No, that was really good.
In your reality, that's how it happened. That's all that matters.
Well, to be fair, my reality does have occasional moments where I'm just like, holy shit, so and so is talking to me. So it's a good life.
Yes, yeah. Like the Ellison call.
Oh, well, yeah. That was just surreal. Talking to Harlan Ellison on the phone was surreal. There's been a number of moments where it's just like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I often feel that way on this podcast, just talking to these people.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine getting a phone call from Harlan Ellison. I think I'd be afraid of that phone call because most of the stories I have heard, not positive.
Well, I was actually a little terrified of him before the first time I called because, among other things, I'm a huge Connie Willis fan. So I was a little irritated on Connie's behalf about certain things that had happened. Yeah. But he was really sweet on the phone. And I wish I still had this voicemail. When I switched phones, I lost it, unfortunately. But I had sent him a copy of one of my collections, and he left me just the nicest voicemail. Yeah. That was really sweet.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, well, let's wrap it up here. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We appreciate it, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care, and be hopeful.
If This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited and produced by Alan Bailey. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrosky, and outro music by Sable Aradia. Intro is by Dave Robison. Transcripts by Jasmine Gielink. Special thanks to our guests, Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow. Thank you all for supporting us, and we will see you again soon.